Hi, welcome to ArkIntel. Picture this, you're buying a $5 coffee at a drive-thru, and before you even get it, a screen pops up asking if you would like to tip 20%, 25%, or maybe even 30%. You're caught off guard, unsure what to do. Say no, and you feel cheap. Say yes, and you're wondering, why am I tipping for this? Tipping isn't what it used to be. It's no longer about rewarding great service. It's about constant demands at every turn. Drive-thrus, takeout counters, food delivery apps, even when there is no service involved, you're being asked for more. This isn't about generosity anymore. It's tipping overload, and it's quietly reshaping the way we spend, one uncomfortable moment at a time. But how did we get here? And how far will it go? Stay with us because the answers might surprise you. Tipping has evolved, and not in a way most of us appreciate. In the 1950s, a 10% tip was the norm. By the 1970s, it rose to 15%. Today, 20% is often considered the bare minimum. A 2022 survey revealed that the average tip is now over 21%, and tipping is no longer limited to just sit-down restaurants. Quick service counters, coffee shops, and even food delivery apps now expect you to leave a little extra. And it's happening more often. In late 2022, tipping at full-service restaurants increased by 17%, while quick service places like coffee shops saw a 16% jump. This isn't just about rising percentages. It's about tipping appearing where it was never expected before. It's no longer an occasional act of gratitude. It's become a constant ask, blurring the line between generosity and obligation. But why does tipping now feel unavoidable? To answer that, we need to look at how technology and the pandemic reshaped this practice. Tipping isn't just a cultural shift, it's being driven by technology. Payment systems like Square, Toast, and Clover have made tipping unavoidable. These sleek tablets present preset options, 20%, 25%, or even 30% right in front of you. Choosing anything less or hitting no tip feels awkward. Smaller options like 5% or 10% are often hidden or completely absent. And the results are staggering. A 2022 study found that 22% of consumers feel pressured to tip more than they normally would when faced with these screens. The bigger the buttons, the bigger the tips. Even major companies like Starbucks have embraced this technology. In 2022, they introduced tipping screens across their stores, ensuring every transaction includes a prompt to leave a tip. For businesses, it's a win. They collect more tips, keep employees happier, and avoid raising wages. This isn't just about convenience. It's a system designed to maximize revenue through psychological pressure. The tipping boom didn't appear out of thin air. The pandemic was a major catalyst. Before COVID-19, tipping for remote transactions like online food delivery was relatively rare, happening just 46% of the time. But by January 2022, the number had skyrocketed to 86%. Customers began tipping for services they would never considered before, like delivery drivers, grocery packers, even takeout orders. And businesses noticed it. What began as a pandemic-induced gesture of generosity quickly became the new normal. Even as life returned to pre-pandemic routines, tipping prompts remained everywhere. And these weren't small tips. Delivery drivers often received as much as 30%. If customers were tipping that much for delivery, businesses began asking, why not prompt them to tip just as much for takeout or even drive-through orders? What started as a way to support essential workers became an expectation, permanently changing how and how often we tip. To understand how tipping became so ingrained, we need to look at its history. Tipping's origins can be traced back to medieval Europe, where wealthy travelers would leave gratuities to ensure good service or even safe passage. But in America, it took a darker turn. After the Civil War, newly freed slaves were often denied wages and told to rely on tips instead. This allowed employers to avoid paying fair wages, shifting the financial burden onto customers. Today, that legacy persists. The federal tipped minimum wage in the US is just $2.13, unchanged since 1991. Tipped workers rely on gratuities to make up the difference, something unique to the United States. In Europe, service charges have replaced tipping, ensuring workers are paid fairly without relying on customer generosity. But not all tipping scenarios are created equal. For restaurant servers, tips make up the bulk of their income, as they are often paid far below the minimum wage. Customers generally understand this and tip accordingly after receiving good service. But what about baristas, cashiers, or fast food workers? These roles typically pay at least minimum wage, yet tipping prompts for them are becoming just as common. Do you tip for someone pouring your coffee, handing you a takeout order? What about cashiers at a drive-thru? These blurred lines leave customers frustrated and workers unsure of what to expect. The inconsistency in tipping culture makes every interaction feel like a moral dilemma, adding to the tipping fatigue many consumers are experiencing. As tipping expectations grow, so does customer frustration. Inflation has stretched budgets. The tipping feels less like generosity and more like a tax. A 2022 study found that 17% of Americans are tipping less because of rising costs, while 60% said they would prefer to eliminate tipping altogether. Even the generosity sparked by the pandemic is fading. In 2021, 56% of customers said they tipped servers 20% or more. By 2022, that number dropped to 43%. Workers are feeling the impact. Bartenders, waiters, and baristas report fewer tips and lower percentages. Customers bombarded by tipping prompts are opting out entirely or tipping less frequently. The constant tipping requests are turning what was once a passive act of generosity into an active choice, one that often leaves customers feeling guilty and resentful. So, where do we go from here? Will tipping continue to climb? 25%, 30%, or even 35%? Or will customers finally say, enough is enough? Some experts argue for eliminating tipping altogether. Instead, businesses could adopt service charges or pay higher wages, as they do in Europe. Others believe tipping will continue to grow as long as social pressure remains strong. What's clear is that the tipping system, built on a foundation of gratitude, has become a web of expectations and frustrations. Something has to give. Tipping began as a way to say thank you, a token of appreciation for great service. But today, it feels more like an obligation, a relentless demand that no one agreed to. At what point does tipping stop being generosity and start being exploitation? The answer to this question might change everything you thought you knew about tipping and where it's headed next.